title of our sermon this morning is a reflection of a song that was arranged by Albert Brumley entitled, "This World Is Not My Home," which David led earlier on this morning. And I had no clue that he was going to read it, nor did you, or he had a clue what I'm going to say. So that's just another great example of how great minds think alike. And I want to read the first part of the first stanza. "This world is not my home. I'm just a passing through. My treasures are laid somewhere beyond the blue. The angels beckon me from heaven's open door, and I can't feel at home in this world anymore." So our text this morning is from Hebrews chapter 11, if you want to go to that, verse 8 to 22, which Brian read a little while ago. And in this passage, we find the title of our lesson in verse 13. "And all these died in faith without receiving the promise, but having seen them and having welcomed them from a distance, and having confessed that they were strangers and exiles on the earth." So last Sunday morning sermon, we noted a pattern in the examples of faith that were given in the early part of Hebrews chapter 11. First, God spoke to those men. Second, they believed God regardless of the circumstances as well as the consequences. Third, they obeyed God regardless of the circumstances or consequences. And fourth, God therefore was pleased and rewarded them. And we call that lesson God's prescription for discouragement. But this morning's lesson, it's going to center on Abraham. The father of the Jews is one of the most beloved characters in all of the Old Testament. He is known as the friend of God, Isaiah 41, verse 8. He is especially noticed in regard to his faith. When Abraham was told how numerous his offspring would be, we are told that in Genesis 15, verse 6, "Then he believed in the Lord, and he, God, reckoned it to him as righteousness." Abraham is also known as the father of the faithful. Not only was he the physical father of all the Jewish race, but he is also the spiritual father of all New Testament Christians baptized into Christ. Galatians 3, verse 29. "And if you belong to Christ, then you are Abraham's offspring, heirs according to the promise." So as we look at Hebrews chapter 11, verse 8 to 22, I want to examine 3 points in our text. As we study each point together, number one, we will look at Abraham and the other Old Testament patriarchs. Number two, at the ones to whom this New Testament letter was addressed. And finally, number three, to stress the point that the Hebrew writer is making to us as well. So the first point is that we are strangers and exiles or pilgrims on the earth. Abraham and the other patriarchs were exiles and strangers. Verse 8, "By faith, Abraham, when he was called, obeyed by going out to a place which he was to receive for an inheritance. He went out not knowing where he was going." Now Abraham was raised in Ur of Chaldees in the Mesopotamian valley among an idolatrous people. Now when God told Abraham to leave there, God simply did not supply him with a McNally map or a travel brochure on how beautiful the land of Canaan would be. Abraham simply went out not knowing where he was going. Even when Abraham and his family reached Canaan, they still had to live by faith. They were always strangers and exiles in a strange land. Verse 9, "By faith he lived as an alien in the land of promise, as in a foreign land, dwelling in tents with Isaac and Jacob, fellow heirs of the same promise." Now, this Greek word translated lived, sojourn, or made is paraklene, and a parakos was a resident alien. He was not much above a slave in a social scale. He was always an outsider. Now, dwelling in tents is another sign of temporary residence. For 75 years, Abraham lived in a solid house in Ur of Chaldees. And for the last 100 years of his life, he lived in a shifting tent. Now, when Sarah died, as Abraham mourned over her demise, he said to the sons of Heth, I am a stranger and a sojourner with you. Genesis 23, verse 4. Again, verse 13 back in Hebrews 11. They were strangers and exiles or pilgrims on the earth. The Greek word translated strangers is from a Greek word meaning a foreigner. So when the social clubs, when they had their common meal, those who sat down were divided into either the members or strangers. The Greek word translated exile or pilgrim literally refers to one who crosses the field. Therefore, not permanent, just passing through the area. His permanent home was somewhere else. Now, back to Hebrews 11. Verse 21, it tells us that Jacob was leaning on the top of his staff. The staff was a symbol of the pilgrim as he prodded along from here to there. Not only was Abraham and the other patriarchs strangers and exiles on earth, but so were the first century Hebrew Christians, as well as us today. The ones to whom the letter was originally addressed needed to understand this, so we do also. Notice how the writer builds on what he says in chapter 11, verse 8 to 22, as he comes to the end of his book of Hebrews in chapter 13, verse 12 to 14. Therefore, Jesus also, that he might sanctify the people through his own blood, suffered outside the gate. Hence, let us go to him outside the camp, which literally means outside the camp of Judaism, bearing his reproach. For here we do not have a lasting city, but we are seeking the city which is to come. As Jesus was crucified outside the gates of Jerusalem, so the Hebrew Christians were being called to leave Jerusalem permanently. The bottom line for them and us as well is, for here in this life we have no permanent city such as Jerusalem or Warren, but we seek one to come that is heaven itself. Like Abraham, we have been called to a new country. In our case, we were called by the New Testament gospel, 2 Thessalonians chapter 2, verse 14. Our permanent abiding place is heaven as described in 2 Corinthians chapter 5, verse 1 and 2. For we know that if this earthly tent, which is our house, is torn down, we have a building from God, a house not made with hands, eternal in the heavens. For indeed, in this house we groan, longing to be clothed with our dwelling from heaven. Then Paul continues in verse 6. Therefore, being always of good courage, and knowing that while we are at home in the body, we are absent from the Lord. Then Paul says in verse 8, we are of good courage, I say, and prefer rather to be absent from the body and to be home with the Lord. Now, in the meantime, we are just traveling through this temporary world. In the late 2nd century, there was a church father called Tertullian. He said of the Christian, he knows that on earth he has a pilgrimage, but his dignity is in heaven. Another 2nd century Christian writer named Clement of Alexandria writes this, we have no fatherland on earth. Now, in the late 3rd century, another church father named Augustine said, we are sojourners, exiled from our fatherland. So the last two of these writers use this word fatherland. That comes from our text, back in Hebrews 11, verse 14. They are seeking a country of their own. The Greek word for country literally means fatherland. In America, we would call that homeland. As New Testament Christians, our fatherland, our real home is heaven. So many things happen to us in this life. Illness, sorrows, tragedies, deaths. How important it is to realize that this home is not our home, this world. In other words, we are just passing through. Now, since we are strangers and exiles on the earth, our second point is that the emphasis of our lives should be on the world to come and not on this life. It is obvious that the emphasis of Abraham and the other patriarchs was not on the here and now. Abraham owned nothing permanent in the land. No land other than the cave of Machpelah for a burial place in Genesis 23, verse 17. When you read the wealth of Abraham, it's almost unbelievable to realize that he never built a house after leaving his fatherland. One importance in the life of Abraham is in our text of verse 9 and 10, dwelling in tents, for he was looking for the city which has foundations, whose architect and builder is God. Tents have no foundation. They are not permanent. They are easily destroyed by the elements of nature. The city Abraham looked for had a solid foundation. It was to be lasting forever. Now, already we noticed in verse 14 that all the patriarchs were seeking a country of their own. Now, verse 16 adds, they desire a better country, that is, a heavenly one. Therefore, God is not ashamed to be called their God, for he has prepared a city for them. When God had appeared to Moses at the burning bush back in Exodus chapter 3, he told Moses in verse 6, I am the God of your father, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. God was not embarrassed to be called their God or to claim them as his children of faith. The first readers of this Hebrew epistle needed to learn that lesson. And since we too are strangers and exiles on the earth, the emphasis of our lives should be on the world to come and not on this life. They needed to realize the importance of spiritual things. Their fellow Jews who were remaining in Judaism would point to the physical Jerusalem temple and the physical sacrifices. The Hebrew writer desired his readers to understand the spiritual is more important than the physical. He stressed that as New Testament Christians, we have a better high priest with better sacrifice, and so on. Most of all, these hesitating readers needed to realize the importance of the eternal. He asked them, he said, are you being persecuted now? Then he reminds his readers, always remember that eternity is ahead. Brethren, do we not need the same lessons still? Because the physical looms so large before our eyes, as the things of this world seem to be so much to us, and that the things of this world take so much of our precious time. But these things are only temporary, and the world is passing away, and its lust. 1 John 2, verse 17. Yet you do not know what your life will be like tomorrow. You are just a vapor that appears for a little while and then vanishes away. James chapter 4, verse 14. If the stress of our lives is on the things that we can see, hear, smell, taste, and touch, how foolish we are. Let me share some scholarly quotations with you. It should always be a mark of the spirit of the Christian that he should own nothing outside himself to which he cannot say goodbye with a smile. That's from Neil Lightfoot in his Jesus Christ Today book of Hebrews, his commentary. Another quote, "The important thing is not what we live in, but what we look for." This is from Risby, his epistle to the Hebrews. Now, one tradition has it that Jesus once said, "The world is merely a bridge. Ye are to pass over and not to build your dwellings upon it." Now, whether Jesus actually said this outside of the Bible, we don't know. Yet it is a true thought. How hard we work attempting to keep up with those around us as we keep trying to build our dwelling on a bridge. Now, this is from James Burton Kaufman's commentary on Hebrews. The New Testament tells us again and again that the emphasis of our lives should be on the world to come. Listen to these verses. We have a heavenly calling, Hebrews chapter 3, verse 1. Our citizenship is in heaven, Philippians 3:20. Lay up for yourselves treasures in heaven, Matthew 6:20. So our treasure is now being sent above. Our Lord is there, and he said, "I go prepare a place for you," John 14:3, which is in heaven. Our hope is in heaven, Hebrews 6, verse 19. Our names are inscribed in heaven, Luke 10, verse 20. Paul says in 1 Corinthians 2, verse 9, "But just as it is written, things which eye has not seen and ear has not heard, and which have not entered the heart of man, all that God has prepared for those who love him." That which is real is not the things that we see all around us. The real thing is in heaven. If this were our attitude, would this not make a tremendous difference? It would make an alteration in how we view misfortune, a modification in how we view problems, a variation in how we view life. If we could not realize that the emphasis of our lives should be on the world to come, would it not make a change in how we view our time? We spend our money and use our abilities or talents. If we really understood that everything in this life is just temporary, here today and gone tomorrow, would this not have a profound effect on our priorities? These are truths that we must grasp. We are but strangers and exiles on the earth. Therefore, the emphasis of our lives should be on the world to come and not on this life's existence. Let us say that we have come to grips with these great truths. We are strangers and exiles on the earth, as well as our emphasis is not on this earth, but on the world to come. Our third point is, what enables one to have such a view of life? The answer is faith. We have noted that Abraham is known as the father of the faithful. God found Abraham's heart faithful or full of faith before him, as recorded in Nehemiah chapter 9, verse 7 and 8. Now, since Abraham was reared in the Ur of Chaldees among an idol-worshiping people. Now, we don't know how or by what revealed the facts that he came to believe in the one true living God and maintained his faith. But he did, and was chosen by God. And as he continued to live a life of obedient faith unto God, it was that faith which enabled him to have a perspective as he did on life, which enabled God to bless him. Again, let's go back to Hebrews 11. Let's read again verse 8 and 9. In verse 8, it starts with the phrase, by faith. Faith is always the key. Then the verse notes how strong that faith was. By faith, Abraham, when he was called, obeyed by going out to a place which he was to receive for an inheritance, and he went out not knowing where he was going. Now, the participle called is in the present tense. It's suggesting that no sooner was the call given that it was obeyed. Westcott, in his epistle of the Hebrews, mentions this. He says, Abraham obeyed the call while it was still ringing in his ears. Now, I like that thought. Then verse 8 notes the challenge of Abraham's faith. He went out not knowing where he was going. He didn't go because God was a good travel agent. He didn't go because he was looking for a better place. He departed strictly on the basis of faith. It was God who had called him, so he went. Verse 9 starts with by faith. So by faith he lived, or he sojourned. Abraham spent the next 100 years in Canaan and the adjoining areas on the basis of his faith in God. Now let us go to several verses of our text that we've not yet covered or noted. These verses continue to emphasize the faith of Abraham, but they also tell us of the faith of Abraham that had rubbed off on those around him. Verse 11 mentions Abraham's wife Sarah. By faith, even Sarah herself received ability to conceive, even beyond the proper time of life, since she considered him faithful who had promised. Now you might recall that at first Sarah laughed at the idea that she would be able to conceive at 89 or 90 years of age. Hers was a growing faith as she came to believe that what God said he could do, he really could do. Now notice the words. She considered him faithful who had promised. Sarah conceived not because of the strength of her faith, but because of the object of her faith, which was God. So she and Abraham are able to stand together as a faithful married couple in and to God. Now verse 17 and 18 tells of the offering of Isaac. I suppose no greater test has ever been made or been given to mortal man. Now how did Abraham meet this challenge? He met it by faith. By faith, Abraham, when he was tested, offered up Isaac, and he who had received the promises was offering up his only son. Verse 19 says Abraham had faith in the power of God to raise Isaac from the dead. He considered that God is able to raise men even from the dead, from which he also received him back as a type. Now is that not amazing? Abraham believed in the resurrection of the dead long before, as far as we know, that God had revealed that truth to mankind in general. Our text then goes on to the offspring of Abraham. It stresses both the length of Abraham's life and the influence that he had on the next generation. Verse 20. By faith, Isaac believed Jacob and Esau, even regarding things to come. Now this refers to Isaac giving Jacob the great blessing of the firstborn. Now Isaac had faith that the hand of God had been involved in that blessing. So he left the blessing as it was, even though Jacob was in reality the second born. Verse 21, by faith Jacob, as he was dying, blessed each of the sons of Joseph and worshiped leaning on the top of his staff. Now the sons of Joseph were Ephraim and Manasseh. Jacob spoke of the future of Joseph's offspring by faith. Verse 22, by faith Joseph, when he was dying, made mention of the exodus of the sons of Israel and gave orders concerning his bones. Joseph, like Abraham, believed the promise that the land of Canaan was intended their promised land, and that someday his people would live in it. So Joseph desired to be buried there centuries later. To wrap up this survey on the faith of Abraham and the patriarchs, let us go back to verse 13, from which we get the title of our lesson. All these died in faith, without receiving the promises, but having seen them and having welcomed them from a distance, and having confessed that they were strangers and exiles on the earth. They were able to die in faith because they had lived by faith. They had seen the promises afar off through the eye of faith. Thus they died in faith, faithful to the end. And this is what the Hebrew writers is trying to desire for his readers as well as us, that what we need. In Revelation 14:13, blessed are the dead who die in the Lord from now on. Yes, says the Spirit, that they may rest from their labors, for their deeds follow with them. We have no greater need than the need for faith. Romans 10:17. So faith comes from hearing, and hearing by the word of Christ. We need a faith that will take God at his word, where we trust in all of his promises. In Luke chapter 1, an angel comes to Zacharias. He's another old man. Just as the angel came to Abraham to tell him that even though he and his wife were old, that they would have a child. So in contrast to Abraham's response of faith, Zechariah, he asks this angel, he says, well, how shall I know this for certain? For I am an old man, and my wife is advanced in years. This is Luke chapter 1, verse 18. Now, the angel Gabriel, obviously disappointed in Zechariah's faith, says in verse 20, and behold, you shall be silent and unable to speak until the day when these things take place, because you did not believe my words, which shall be fulfilled in their proper time. When God says something in his word, is our response like that of Abraham, or is it like that of Zacharias? Brethren, we need the kind of faith that Abraham and the patriarchs had. A faith that acts upon the word of God. As in James chapter 2, verse 14 to 26, where you have the same conclusion in 3 verses. Verse 17, even so, faith, if it has no works, is dead being by itself. Verse 24, you see that a man is justified by works and not by faith alone. Verse 26, for just as the body without the spirit is dead, so also faith without works is dead. When God says something, we should not hesitate to believe it and then obey as we are told to. There's a funny story that has a serious side about a tourist who came across a sign that said the bridge was out on a main highway. Well, the sign directed him to take a very unattractive detour. So the fella, he looks down the road ahead, and it appears to be real straight, and it looks all clear the way down. So he decides to go forward. And he thinks to himself, well, you know, that must be an old sign. Surely that bridge is no longer out today. Well, 15 miles farther on, he comes to the missing bridge. Not too happy. So he turns the car around and he heads back to the detour. Shortly after making the detour, he comes to a freshly painted sign that says, it sure was, wasn't it? Brethren, when God says something in his word, let us believe and just do it. How sad if in the judgment day any of us have to sadly say, it sure was true, wasn't it? If you remember nothing else that I have said in this lesson, I hope you will remember the following. This earth is not our home. This world is filled with problems, with pain and perplexities. So how can we make it day by day? How can we survive the long, dark nights? We can make it by faith. God helps us to live by faith so that someday we can die in faith. And it begins now by dying to self, taking self off the throne of your life and replacing it with Jesus. Belief, repentance, and water baptism for the washing away of your sins is where you start the Christian life. Then walk the walk as a stranger and an exile here, remaining faithful unto death, and you will be heaven-bound. So if you need to respond to his invitation, come right now as together we stand and as we